It's quite a complex story, I suppose. At one level, yes, my entry point into all of these studies really of artistic objects was as a scientist, because I found at the time when I just began getting interested in all this that, after all, at the end of the day, the objects which are created for ritual are made of materials, and so the material technology was really what I began getting interested in as a trained physicist and engineering physicist and so on. That was just after my stint in IIT. But I was also a practicing Bharatanatyam dancer for many years, and of course, so we are exposed to this grandeur of this imagery of the Nataraja, which we are told represents the dance of Shiva. But at that stage, perhaps I didn't know as much about it, so I really began my journey into it as a scientist. But it's really later that all the philosophical dimensions really were brought more alive to me as I went into the study of it in a more intense way. So that's why when I think of it, it's really been a journey about the elements of Shiva's dance. And I use that the term elements as a pun. On the one side, I was looking at the actual physical elements of, the metals, the copper, tin, iron, or zinc, lead, and of course the alloying composition, which is basically of bronze. So it's mainly of copper, tin, or lead. Let's say leaded bronze or brass with copper with zinc. But it was also a journey into understanding the elements of Shiva's dance, because in a way, as you get into it, you understand that the whole conception of Shiva Nataraja is one where he is also said to represent the 5 elements, the Panchabhuta, according to Shaiva Siddhantic principles. So that is earth, wind, water, fire, and ether or Akasha. And so that's why I think it is a very metaphoric term for me, because in a way there are these 2 dimensions which, in one sense, they are, you study them differently, but they all, I suppose, in a way kind of converge into a kind of very holistic understanding, which is very beautiful. And I think also the fact that one of the things that my study was able to show was that, from the lead isotope ratio proportions that one could find for different groups of bronzes. For the Chola bronzes, we had a different lead isotope signature, which is different from Vijayanagara and which is different from Pallava, and so on. And so from that, I was able to show that probably the Nataraja bronze was already formulated by the Pallava period, predating the Chola period, let's say about 800 or so AD, and before about the 10th century Chola period. And that's, in a way, it could be, if that is shown to be the case, because I did find a couple of Nataraja images which seem to be earlier than Chola. And that's quite significant when you look at it in relation to the whole corpus of devotional poetry that was part of this whole vision of the cult of Nataraja worship. The worship of Nataraja at in the early Thevaram hymns and so on by Appar and Sundarar, and then other saints like Manikavachakar and so on, and all the whole corpus of poetry, devotional poetry, which was composed around this image of Nataraja worshipped as Thillai. Of course, in the earlier period, in the 7th to 9th centuries or so, it was the image was also known as Kutan, just simply Kutan or dancer, which is quite beautiful in a way. I think Nataraja is a more Sanskritic term which you don't find in the early, let's say, Thevaram hymns or Tamil devotional hymns, but that comes in later. And it's quite exciting, because when you look at, what is also special about, so really the fact that the image was probably already conceived in the Pallava period, tied in with that body of devotional poetry. For instance, you have verses of Appar which talk about the sweet golden foot lifted in dance, where perhaps he's already referring to a bronze icon and things like that. And later on, those ideas, of course, get gelled into, more mystical understanding maybe, and then you have, at a later phase in Chidambaram, you have these more philosophical connotations coming in, because the term Thillai, which also refer to the earlier temple of Sittambalam, which is in Tamil, then becomes Chidambaram, which we then interpret to be the most Sanskritized term of Chit, plus Ambaram, which is Chit is the consciousness and Ambaram maybe the cosmos. So, maybe there is that element of a more metaphysical description of, the cosmic consciousness. But already if you see in some of those hymns, the devotional hymns, you do have some of these mystical cadences, especially, for example, in the work of Manikavachakar. It's very beautiful, some of the verses when he sings of, when will I get to gaze upon the one who is earth, wind, water and fire. And again he uses this word in Tamil which is very beautiful, unaradu, to try and understand, oru unarvu, the one who is, so in terms of understanding and comprehension, so maybe like a consciousness, the one who, yes, the one who is about comprehending or understanding or whatever. So so there is this, or rather one consciousness, you could call it that as well. And also you find in Appa's verses, then he talks about, he uses this word Nilavu, and he says that he invokes Nataraja as the one who is Nilavu and who will fill me with sky and make me be. So this idea of just filling you in sky and making you be. And the beauty also is also that some of these poets, these Shaiva Siddhantic poets, they were dancers themselves, because Manikavachakar, in fact, he sings of this when he says that the one who will enter my agam, inner self, and make me dance. So it gives you a sense that it's not just about worshipping an image of an icon of a dancer, but the sensation that it just makes you get up and dance. And I think that is really what is so stirring about this image, the balance between equilibrium and equipoise and the whole devotional poetry. Yes, and the way in which the dance in a way is something which connects the inner self with the outer space, the inner space and the outer space. And then later on, when I was able to perhaps show that this image also may have included some concept of a more literal cosmic perception, because you also have the idea of the Akasha Lingam, where the Nataraja is worshipped as Akasha or space at Chidambaram or ether. And so we were able to show that the image also perhaps is connected to the star positions of the Orion constellation, with the belt aligning along the waist of Nataraja, and the Arudra, the star or Betelgeuse being along the shoulder of Nataraja, because there is a festival which is held in Chidambaram every year in December, and the festival of Margari Thiruvathurai, which is connected to what is called this Arudra Tandava Darshanam. And this is some studies that I did in collaboration with an astrophysicist who's no more, Nirupama Raghavan. Well, maybe it's just anyway, we all look at the skies, and every culture observe the skies. So it doesn't need a very, very, let's say, intricate cosmological understanding to make that connection to the skies. But, and also the interesting aspect of the lifted leg perhaps being, pointing towards the star Sirius when you look at it. And these were also some conversations I had with one of the Dikshitar at Chidambaram, who's no more, Raja Dikshitar, and his family and associates. So, but anyway, so the point is that I see it as something which tries to connect this element of, the inner self with the outer space as well. But of course there are layerings of meanings, because it's not only about that, because also the whole bhakti movement was also one where, they were, it was about rebelling against, let's say, the institutionalized or Brahminical religious system, and having a more direct and personal connection with, your personal God and so on. And that is also, I think, what explains why, it's quite interesting in the Chola pieces that there are so many bronzes actually capturing the, the poet saints themselves, like Manikavachakar and, Sundarar and Appar and several, let's say, ordinary people, like you have one of Paravai Nachayar and so on, devotees and saints and things like that, which gives you a glimpse into something of a more ordinary life. It's not only the God and the deity who is, let's say, depicted. It's not only about Vishnu and Shiva and Krishna and Rama. Those are also there. But you also get a chance for the, let's say the ordinary person to be reflected. You have portraits of gods and, you know, portraits of queens as well. For instance, the widowed Queen Sembian Mahadevi, there's also a portrait of her, and she was one of the very well-known and famous patrons of bronzes. And that too to me is very interesting, because Sembian Mahadevi was the one under whom, let's say, the Nataraja image starts, you know, being really manifest in the in stone, and also numerous bronzes and all that coming very prominently into vogue. And if you look at her life story, I mean, it's one where it's almost as if, in a sense, there is a literal experience of creation emerging out of destruction, because her husband Gandharaditya Chola, you know, fasted to death because he was a devotee of Shiva. And you know, following that, she dedicates many temples also to Gandharaditya Chola and so on, you know, this 10th century queen, which is quite remarkable. And there's a town which is named after her as well, which few people know about. And it's almost like there is a symbolic, you know, emergence of, you know, creation out of destruction. Though on the other hand, it's also equally possible, because the Shiva image is also a one which reflects a sort of very martial imagery as well. It's about, you know, the dance of death and destruction and so on as well. So there is that, you know, the fierce, the Raudra aspect. And so to that extent, there could be also a political connotation. Perhaps it was, you know, a symbol of the, you know, the political power and the martial power of the Cholas. So there are a range of interpretations that art historians and so on would get into, I guess. So, I mean, so it's of course left up to us how we interpret and so on. So, but certainly the transcendence would have had to have played a role, because otherwise you would not get such mastery of the craftsmanship, where the craftsmen seem to have really, you know, gone beyond merely just visualizing the icon. There is a sense of the transcendental when you look at many of these bronzes, which is why, you know, they remain artistic masterpieces. Yeah, and that is where, as you were asking, the idea of rasa comes in as well, because they, especially if you look at the Chola bronzes, they really capture that sense of rasa very beautifully, you know, where each piece just about captures some expression, whether it's a devotee, you know, or whether it is, in there's some very beautiful ones of Manikavachakar holding the palm leaf and so on, you know, which they really speak to you, or some of those images of the goddesses and so on, the Devi images and so on. So that attempt to bridge the materiality and the humanness and the connection with the cosmic, I think that's a very special kind of transition. You know, if you look at the Renaissance, maybe it was a fantastic period, because again it connected art and science in a very rich way. But I think prior to the Renaissance also, the Chola bronzes managed to do something very amazing in terms of connecting art, spirituality and science, I suppose. And but I don't think that it's necessary to attribute that particular linkage to you know, just a body of, let's say, religious situation or milieu, or that it needs only to have had a written milieu to capture. Because if you look at this very amazing site that I visited, you know, Sanganakallu in northern Karnataka, which is a prehistoric site, and already you see in 3000 BC people were experimenting with rocks and trying to, you know, perhaps generate some sounds. Yes, you've seen that video. And there's people, you know, figures of people as if they were dancing, you know, with hands linked and so on. And there's this expanse of sky and, you know, rock and everything. And so this connection with inner and outer space, it's something which I think, you know, is a very kind of early and important impulse, you know, of humankind. And these were people who, this was even before writing came into vogue and all that. So you can see, this is in 3000 BC, and you can see these impulses perhaps over time, you know, taking more sophisticated shapes, concretizing and being codified and so on, and then you get all the great, you know, let's say, dance and music traditions and such like. So, but I think it's a very primal sort of impulse, you know, just as, I think, just as we stargaze and just as we use our bodies to move and dance. There's another very interesting aspect about the Nataraja, if you look at it, which is the dance, the way he's dancing on top of the figure, you know, that is called Muyalagan in Tamil, it's called Apasmara in Sanskrit, maybe Apasmara as in, you know, ignorance or whatever at a metaphoric level. But Muyalagan also actually sometimes is used apparently to describe somebody who is epileptic or something. So it's almost like a kind of description of, you know, order over something which is seen as, you know, less orderly or, you know, physically debilitating or whatever, a state of, you know, of the symmetry and everything is in a way like an ordering and showing a kind of coming together of a more perfect organization over something which is less, more, less a more chaotic sort of form or whatever. And so it seems to be conveying a lot of things at different levels. Of course, it's also up to us how we interpret it, but it's also quite staggering in terms of the visual imagery at how much it actually does convey, because if you look at the locks, and the motion, the wavy motion, again, you can understand why the sentiment of why we tend to attribute this idea of the cosmic dance to it, which is in a way maybe a contemporary reading, through many, scientists and philosophers of our times like Carl Sagan or Kumaraswamy and so on. But nevertheless, that temptation is there to kind of look at it in those terms. And you do have some very beautiful verses as well. For instance, there are some stotras in the Vadnagar Prashasti, which does talk about the scattering of the stars and the dance of Shiva and so on. So this idea that of a cosmic correlation between what the whole idea of movement and dance, and the connection that has, I think, as human beings, we are not still, we're mobile all the time. So this relationship with the cosmos is a very dynamic one, and so we can, and also the takeaway from that is also that you can order it as best as you can, which is, in a way what that image does, it sort of seeks to create order and so on. And I think I'm also wanted to, it inspired this dance production that I did also called Dans Etoiles, where we had, because in this very quantum mechanical world, there's so much of uncertainty and everything is very, disordered in a way. And the orderliness is a very kind of classical physics kind of thing, So, and in a way, Bharatanatyam sort of represents that kind of very orderly, the symmetry and so on, the movements, every look is balanced and orderly, you one movement goes down, one goes another, one hand goes up and down and so on. So, you're all constantly creating order, which is what, as I said, that top image of Nataraja is doing. And then there was this other dancer who is, I suppose, trained more in a kind of contemporary dance, milieu, Anusha Emrit from France, and we did it as an internet stream performance, and her, choreography was completely very quantum mechanical, if you know what I mean. But it was like, it's what you could imagine was going on in a very quantum mechanical world, very uncertain and spooky and this and that. You can see that link and see, and so it was this layering of the two in a way, because they're both, I suppose, facets of our universe, and the coming together of that. And so in a way, that also brought together this idea of, creation and destruction, the two rasas which you were talking about, Raudra and Shanta. Because Raudra, in a way, creation, as I said, is in a way the Shanta rasa, and Raudra is, destruction is the rasa may be associated with destruction, Raudra. And so we were trying to balance that and to show that in a way that creation destruction metaphor is really that, creation really comes out of destruction, and where I see, as I said with Sembi and Mahadevi, is that in her own personal life, it's out of the loss, let's say, of Gandharaditya that you see a lot of, her acts of patronage. So even in your own personal experience, you see that sometimes your own creativity is provoked by difficult circumstances, by loss, and by, pain, loss, destruction, all of these things, loss of people you care about, and many other kinds of things. So to that extent, I think that image also to me brings, that element of, let's say, as I said, creativity emerging out of destruction, and the balance between Raudra and Shanta. And that's what we were also trying to convey in that, dance production. And in the end, the interesting thing is our faces sort of merge, because it's an internet stream performance. She was dancing in, it's a virtual, real and virtual kind of performative thing. And when those two faces merge, our faces merge, it's like a completely different face. So even in the world of, in the world of virtuality or, computers or whatever, you can't, it's quite exciting when something new is created out of something. Yes, exactly. The ancient and the modern, coming up with something completely different. So I think that's So it was a very unique journey in that sense. I think sometimes it's not that easy to write or talk about it, but it's something, a very felt personal journey. Aim to be religious in that sense or whatever. I mean, as a scientist, I do subscribe to, a certain degree of atheism, but still it does shake you, because you do get the feeling of, at least of, maybe it's like with the theory of things, there's something happening there where we are not totally disconnected from the out there or that reality. There is some interaction in our experiences. There are some Jungian things, coincidences and things like that we cannot explain really, and there is something intangible out there which is, yes, I suppose you could call it transcendental, or you could call it the unmanifest or whatever, but something that reaches out to you like this. So many opposites over there, he's an ascetic, he's as you say, there is also the erotic aspect, the phallic symbol, the cosmic pillar, and but I think the fact that you need to reconcile so many of these dualities and live through them, maybe, which is quite, for me, the remarkable thing, that for me it's a lived experience. I mean, I don't think I could say that it's just been, at one point it was as a researcher, but then I felt there were so many things which happened, I mean, which I can't explain even now, like for instance this astrophysicist whom I collaborated with, and Nirupama Raghavan, even the timing of when she passed away and things like that, there was this, when I'd given this presentation, and anyway, those are all personal things I don't want to talk about really, which is a private space, but still there are many things, which is really beyond vision, as I'd like to say, in a very metaphorical sense, which and I think what I like about the image, though, the beauty, as you say, is the fact that there are so many bizarrenesses to it. I mean, at one point, Shiva, even if you read the Thevaram hymns, he's really described as a madman who's just dancing around the cremation, fields and things like that, and it's a wild, and it's a very kind of, it's a ghoul, he's dancing with the ghouls and things like that. It's not necessarily a beautiful vision all the time, at times maybe it is, of course, and but the fact that so many people subscribe to all of this, it must have had its frightening sides as well, let's face it, because a tantric ritual or whatever might have been associated with it, but it's very moving to think of how much of philosophy emerged out of it, the kind of the thinking that went into it and so on. And you have to respect that body of thought in its entirety. I don't think there's any point picking out just the beautiful bits and all, but you have to, in the totality of it, Definitely there, as I said, this sense of ordering your physical world, and that's, I'm talking about the physical in terms of the body as well. And ordering it so that those objects of visual beauty, and it could have been, let's say, within the Hindu circumstance, the visual beauty you could have is in different ways. Let's say, for instance, in Islam and in the mosques, it's all using completely non-figurative renditions. It's just arabesques and this and that and the other, and the figures absolutely has no place in it. Whereas in the Hindu conception, the figure is the beauty, and that is in a way also something quite extraordinary, and they're both wonderful conceptions, if you ask me, in their own way, and they've led to very interesting art, in their own way, looking at it from that way. For me, I think my primary lens of looking at religion is the aesthetics and that it generates or creates, because it's not for me something that has to have a kind of religious approach in that sense. So if you look at it aesthetically, it's very interesting the different type of arts those two approach created, which are both very rich and wonderful. As I said, the non-figurative, which is just then mathematical or geometrical, and as you see in Islam and as you see in Hinduism, it's all about the body and the figural, all of the beauty or whatever mostly that is conveyed in the temples is through the body, although and the body becomes the geometry, the figure becomes the one that you replicate here and there and everywhere, and the body and the conceptions of that, along with, let's say, other things like the vegetation and the foliage and animal and all that. So it's all very much about animation, lived creations. So it's a kind of visualized philosophy in a way, which must have had, which I think the fact that you had for instance in Chidambaram, the descriptions of the Karanas and so on put there. Of course, some of those descriptions of the Karanas are not necessarily all, it's a mixture of, looking at animal movement and things like that. Like the Bhujanga Trasita itself is, which you see with the Nataraja, image. It is supposed to be the serpent fright, like the foot is frightened by the serpent and moving away. So it's a mixture of the mundane and the more sublime or whatever at all times, and I find that also very endearing in a way. It's not just a concept of spirituality which is filled with abstractions in a way. It's left to your imagination to maybe savor both those dimensions, if you like. And whether or not that was the original significance, I think that's what's very exciting for us today, is that it allows us to savor both these dimensions, as I said, the mundane and the spiritual at the same time. I was also recollecting a very beautiful verse by Manika Vachakar which says, Adiyum Antamum Illa Arul Porul Jyotiye, that is the one who is without beginning and end. Mundiya Mudal Irudiyom Anai, which is like, again, the one without, the beginning and the end, and the one who's at the center. So I think all of that body of poetry has to be revisited and understood a bit more, in depth. And there's also a very beautiful verse by Andal again, which also for me is very interesting as a scientist, because there's a connection between the materiality of the bronzes and the actual lost wax process, where they made the image by, first making a model out of wax, and then they covered it with clay and then heated the mold so that the wax pours out, and then they pour in the metal. And she compares these rain clouds, which are like liquid wax within, the clay mold. So rain on the Lord Venkatam, that is Vishnu. So she had an understanding of the lost wax process to be able to write that, to say, that the mold, to rain down the liquid wax on him, and the comparison to rain clouds. So even the technical processes had a certain metaphysical meaning, like even the mold, even today they call it karu, which is basically the womb. So it is as if it's like, the creation of the image or the icon it's the cosmic, but there's also a human dimension. It's like the creation of the, it's like of birth when you create an icon and whatever, Yeah, so it's almost like the divinity is within. Like, I think that is the whole idea of Shaiva Siddhanta. It's about experiencing the deity. It's not just about, maybe in a very literal way also, because the Shaiva Siddhantic is also supposed to dress like Shiva, like ascetics, and they even used to literally dress like that, wear the tiger skin and things like that. So it's a question of, maybe in those days you could take it as a literally becoming the deity in some way, but there's also the metaphoric way of experiencing the divinity within. And there I see that connect also, which is quite interesting to me, this use of the term agam, which keeps coming up, like Manika Vachakar talks about, entering his agam. And that again is an idea which, in a way, if you see it in Sangam literature, you have the Agam and the Puram. The 3rd century Sangam Tamil literature has that sense of the inner space and the outer space, and the connecting of the inner and the outer space. Intuitive ideas, yes, the fact that they intuitively could have picked up some of these nuances and the poetry and the aesthetics of it, to have translated it into some aesthetic form, because that is also a very beautiful aspect of Chidambaram, the fact that the image is worshipped as both the Akashalingam and the Nataraja, the anthropomorphic form and the formless. So there's the dancing form, and yes, exactly, and that seems to kind of be a metaphor coming through together there. And again, that does remind you of aspects of modern physics, like wave particle duality or whatever. But it's a metaphoric thing. I wouldn't take it too literal beyond that. But still, we can enjoy these metaphors and value them for the deeper meaning they give to us, and the significance that we can draw in the midst of all our very mundane lives, like wriggling through traffic and this and that. Connection with poetry is very important, because if you look at that, let's say, period, the 9th to 10th century, there's a lot of connection with poetic forms and things like that. And maybe earlier too there were textual traditions, and then at some point, yes, it does get very ritualistic. And maybe, I mean, invasions, everybody would like to blame everything to invasions, but let's also face it, the fact that the literary traditions then came into the hands of just a handful of people, let's say the Brahminical community and all that, and so the wider learning, writing and all that was not, after a certain point, maybe available in a broader sense. That's why it also became very ritualized and codified. So that knowledge of what the significance was and all that was probably then only in the hands of a few, which was not being translated to, let's say, a wider group of people, which is what is really fascinating about the Bhakti movement, because it broke through all of that, and then all of those meanings and the mystical connotations and all, in an allegorical way, were made to a wider set of people. Like if you look at the poetry of Akka Mahadevi, where she was wandering around naked with these vachanas of Shiva and so on. And again, she uses a very interesting metallurgical metaphor, I would say, where she talks about weld, so that the weld is not seen, where she's saying that it's almost like about transcendence. You create something, you do something where the hard work of it, where the let's say the nitty gritty and the baser aspects, the welding and the crack of it, all that is not seen, and then it's just the beauty of it is that is there. So again, that's about transcendence. And so, but that's the beauty of it, that the Bhakti movement, which was probably in the absence of a very codified tradition, through the use of other means of communication, okay, maybe there was a literary tradition there where they also wrote poems, but there was other means of communication through dance, music and so on. So the transcendence came through those aspects. So, and that was how, let's say, it was made available to a wider group of people, those kinds of aspects. So, I mean, that's a very complex question as to where and how. Obviously, the fact that you've had disruptions from, different historical forces or whatever, and then, whether it was different religious, disturbances or colonial and that, all those things may be factors. But I think it's a complex set of factors. I don't think you can, kind of blame any particular, or rather pinpoint it to any particular kind of activity. And in a way, to some extent, even when Islam came, it did bring new waves of more scientific thinking as well, approaching materiality in a different way. So every kind of, let's say, external stimuli has its good and its bad. So it's and then out of that you also get, let's say, the mingling of Bhakti and Sufi traditions, which was also very interesting. If a whole new impulse there, creative impulse. If you look at, as you see transcendence, there has to be an element of, well, at least I won't say being scientific, but appreciating the science of things. Mythology as allegory sort of goes away a bit, and then that becomes problematic, I suppose. I don't know, but then that moves away to some extent from the idea of transcendence and all, which I think was such a great thing of our, let's say, Upanishadic writing and so many philosophical traditions like Advaita or Vedanta, and so that ability to seek out transcendence, which is quite unique in a way and phenomenal. So there's both two sides to our traditions, a very, very kind of hyper mythological thing, which is like as fantastical as possible, and very kind of in a way abstract and going into very transcendental and abstract sort of thinking, which is also very the fact that both coexist. So so we need to recognize that and reconcile and try to live with that as well too, because while maintaining the balance. And I think we need to believe and suspend belief also. I think we really need to suspend belief at one level, otherwise we'll be in a lot of trouble, because there are just far too many gods to believe in, right? So we do need to appreciate the transcendence behind our Indic thought and everything, and to nourish that and cherish that as well.
The contradictions are very much aesthetic.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, and I think that the works of art try to reconcile that, is what is so amazing. Like
we have all these figures of big temples and all this, and still we have this concept of Parabrahma.
Yes, yes, exactly. So there is that awareness of the transcendence at all times as well. As you said, the Parabrahma or the Akasha Lingam within, or the, even the Nathdwara paintings where you see, Krishna in the middle of this, the rivers are just painted with all these swirling kind of waves, and it's the conception of again Vishnu in the ocean, kind of thing. Again, something transcendental when you look at that, and obviously they was trying to convey some philosophy of transcendence, so definitely.